Today I'm going to cover what you can do if you don't have a Dutch oven. I've got a dough all mixed and my oven's preheated, so we'll bake up a loaf pan loaf. And then I'm going to mix up our beginner sourdough recipe and talk about why this is for beginners and how it'll make things easier when you're just getting started. Okay, so I've got my oven preheated to 450 and we're going to bake this loaf in a loaf pan. Technically it's what we would call an open bake. So a lot of sourdough is baked in a Dutch oven. That's a pretty standard process. It's easy to learn about, but if you don't have a Dutch oven, you can still proceed. There's several kinds of open bakes. There's where you just put the dough in the oven on a piece of parchment paper, either on a cookie tray or a stone. But then there's also where you can cook it within a loaf pan. It's open because it's open on top, but the loaf pan helps it to keep its structure and shape while it's baking. So one thing that I'm going to do is I've taken this tray of water, or this tray, and I filled it with water, and I'm going to put it on the bottom rack of my oven. And while I'm shaping, it's going to heat up with the oven. So usually when I'm baking in loaf pans or open bake, I'll let that tray of water sit in the oven until it's boiling, I guess you could say, just because then I know it's distributing steam. So it's doing two things. It's keeping the bottom of your bread from baking too much and getting too hard as it cooks all the way through. And it's also putting some steam into the oven. Sourdough needs steam and moisture in order to spring when it cooks. So while we're waiting for that to start bubbling, we'll start shaping. If you're watching this video and it's because you don't have a Dutch oven, there's a really good chance that you don't have a lot of tools. There's lots of things that can make making sourdough easier. If you only buy one tool, I suggest you get a scale. I got mine from Amazon Basics. It was around $10. And a scale just helps you with accuracy, consistency. A lot of the recipes that are out there only come in grams. It's not that you can't convert it to cups and measures, but it's just a lot easier. A couple of other things you might want are a dough whisk. You might want a bench scraper. You of course might want a Dutch oven. You might want a stand mixer. There's lots of tools. I've created an idea list on Amazon. I'll link it in the comments. And I'll also put a link to our Facebook group, which has all of our tutorials written out. So I mixed this dough up yesterday and went through the whole stretch and fold process and got it all ready. And then I placed it in this plastic container and I marked its height. So you can see the red line where its height was when I put it out for bulk proofing. And you can see that it's grown nicely. So this container has a little bit of an angle, so I'm not looking for exactly doubled in height, but this is definitely doubled. It's bubbly. It's got a nice dome on top. I actually, several times during the process with this, stuck this dough in the fridge to pause it, to slow down proofing, just because I've got a busy schedule. So here's my dough. So the first thing I'm gonna do is get it out of the container, and I'm going to pre-shape it. And then after I've pre-shaped it, I'm gonna let it rest for a little while, and then I'm gonna do its final shaping. So while it's resting, I'll prep our pan and get everything ready for us to get our dough and our bread into the oven. So a lot of people use a bench scraper for pre-shaping and for shaping their bread. For me, I find that my dull knife works just fine. I want a bench scraper, I just don't have one. But anything that's got sort of a smooth edge and is going to help you handle your dough less with your hands is going to be helpful here. This was a half batch of the beginner sourdough recipe that I have posted on my Facebook page at Sourdough for Beginners. It's a low hydration recipe, which makes it much easier to work with for beginners. You can start increasing the percentage of water to your percentage of flour over time, and that's going to give you, you know, fluffier breads and more bubbles and all sorts of things. But the reality is that high hydration is really quite hard to work with and quite sticky. So if you're a beginner, start with a low hydration, master that, do it a bunch of times, try it a bunch of different ways, find the way that works perfectly for you, and then start working your way up with your hydration. So we're going to pre-shape this dough. So a pre-shape, all we're doing is bringing the dough together and starting to coax it into a shape. So I'm touching it as little as I can with my hands. I'm using my bench scraper. Mine, of course, is makeshift. If you want a bench scraper, like I said, I've got that Amazon ideas list linked below. But all I'm going to start to do is coax this bread into the shape of a loaf. There's lots of air in there. You can see it's starting to get smooth on top, starting to hold its shape a little bit. Okay, so I've built some tension. I've got it pre-shaped. I'm just going to let it sit and rest for a minute. It's going to start to spread out, and then we're going to get it prepared for our final shape. So we're going to bake in a loaf pan. We are going to have the bread in parchment paper in the loaf pan, and we're going to place the loaf pan on top of a cookie tray, just so it's easier to manage. And then towards the end of the bake, we're going to take the loaf out of the loaf pan and just let it brown up on the bottom and the sides on the cookie tray. When I'm shaping, I'm going to use rice flour to help me shape, and also to dust on top right before I score the bread. So I'm going to flour up the parchment paper nicely so that the bread doesn't stick to it while it's baking. And I'm going to flour the counter where I'm going to be shaping my dough. Okay, so our dough has settled. It's ready to shape. Our tray of water in the oven is bubbling nicely. So we're going to get ready and put this in the oven to bake. But first we're going to shape it. So when we shape, remember, it's very sticky. This is when we start using flour, but I'm just going to get my fingers under the edge of my dough. I'm going to lift it straight up and flip it down onto my floured surface. I'm going to spread it out a little. I'm going to make a pamphlet. So bottom third up, top third down. I like to take these sticky parts at the end and tuck them a little. And then we're going to roll. Now I'll start flouring up my hands, and I'm just going to shape this bread. So I'm going to take my loaf, set it on the parchment paper, and then fling it right into my loaf pan. So here we are. We are ready to score. I'm just going to put a simple score on this loaf. I'm going to dust it on top with rice flour. Again, in the Amazon list, there's lots of special razors that you can get that are specifically for scoring bread. I'm just using a men's face shaving razor. So I just put a basic score on there, and now I'm going to put this in the oven for 25 minutes. The bread's been in for 25 minutes. I rotated it 180 degrees and then left it in another 20 minutes. Now I'm going to take it out and remove it from the loaf pan to let it brown up for the last bit. So I'm going to pull out my bread, and I'm also going to pull the water tray out now as well. So I'm just going to take my bread out of the loaf pan and you have to take it. And I'm going to sit it on my tray. And I'm just going to stick it in the oven for a few minutes so that the bottom and the sides get a little more brown. But as you can see, it's almost fully cooked at this point. So I'm just going to give it about 5 minutes. That's as simple as it is when you loaf pan bake. Now you can bake without a Dutch oven. Next, I'm going to mix up our beginner sourdough recipe that's posted on our Facebook page. I'll put a link to that in the description, the written one. But I'm going to do that in another video. So come back and see it. It should be posted fairly soon. But let me know what you think about the loaf pan. And if you've got any questions at all, just ask. Thanks.